There we are. I mean, it's going to be very old school. I have no slides, and that's primarily because I did not know what to put on these slides. But I'm going to talk to you in a very old-fashioned way, addressing you. I hope it's not going to be boring, because we had some great slides here, especially with the cartoons, Andreas. Shout out to Andreas. Thanks so much, Jolt, for inviting me. And I think one of the reasons, one of the secret reasons, but correct me if I'm wrong, why I'm invited by Jolt is that we do share a deep interest in ideology production on the political right. And it seems to me that whenever Jolt and I are in a room, we end up talking a long time about like all of the new books conservatives write and have recently written. And my talk is going to touch on this. So unlike many others, I will, I guess, present you more with some more preliminary thoughts about thinking about particular developments on the, say, political right, analytically speaking. And I do think that numerous new works that try to stake out what a conservative project today should look like pose some really interesting challenges to liberals, to liberal Democrats. And as a democratic theorist and someone who probably is a bit of a hobby historian as well, who tries to think about these problems as part of an ongoing struggle between perhaps progressives and conservatives, whatever you now associate with these terms, I think these contemporary debates are incredibly interesting. I'm going to talk in particular about a couple of authors who emerged on the American right, primarily because my sense is that they still aren't very popular in Europe, although that's not entirely true. I do encounter a lot of people who read these authors here too, not least in Christian circles. And I think it's worthwhile really taking them seriously because as far as I can tell, I mean, I don't treat really anyone a priori as a cynic. I don't treat them as cynics either. I think they're very genuine about their ambition, but that's maybe something we need to take seriously also as we think about democracy conceptually, theoretically, as we think about what might be a normative defense for the kinds of things that we consider important, such as constitutionalism or moral universalism, whatever you now think is important. So I'm going to start with an assumption that, I have rarely been challenged on, and I'm curious what you think about it. And that's the assumption that liberals or liberal Democrats today typically believe that liberalism provides a framework for managing the free and peaceful coexistence of people who hold a variety of different worldviews or views of the good life, right? I think this is not just a common everyday intuition that liberals hold. This is something you find in liberal writing, in liberal philosophy. I only need to, now mention John Rawls. He thought, of course, that in a well-ordered liberal society, that was a language he used, there is no reasonable, these are Rawls's words, religious, philosophical, or moral doctrine affirmed by all citizens, and still the society is held together by a sort of agreement on some sort of thin political conception of justice. And you find similar ideas. Now, this is maybe the most famous way of putting it in the 20th century, but you find similar ideas across liberal writings. And I guess many political scientists who look at what's going on in democracies today empirically have a similar thinking about what's valuable about liberalism ultimately and liberal democracy, that we have somehow, a demanding, maybe sometimes too demanding, but somehow stable, minimal agreement on what the rules of the game are, what institutions should enable social coordination and cooperation. And there's, of course, a question whether this, this minimal sense of what liberalism is ultimately about is a correct description of liberal democratic societies. And I think that question, we might, productively discuss this here in this room or elsewhere. But I actually think what's interesting is that most contemporary anti-liberal conservatives, including those who have been enormously influential on the right in the US and elsewhere, the likes of Patrick Deneen from Notre Dame University and others that I will mention in a bit, they really challenge this assumption and answer in the negative. They say, no, look, liberalism is not this minimal consensus. It's not this minimal sort of, agreement, reasonable agreement on justice that we can all arrive at. Liberalism is something homogenizing, it's something totalizing, and it pervades every aspect of our society. Patrick Deneen, in a book that you all probably have heard of or read, Why Liberalism Failed, starts out by saying liberalism is not merely, as is often portrayed, a narrowly political project of constitutional government. That's how most, I guess, also empirical political scientists think about it. Rather, says Deneen, it seeks to transform all of human life and the world. It is, in my translation, not a harmless system for ensuring, or let alone a politically neutral system for ensuring that everyone can live in accordance with their reasonable, comprehensive doctrines, as Rawls would put it. It is itself, again, in Rawlsian language, a comprehensive doctrine, and one that seeks to extend its reach to become completely hegemonic. And if you ask someone like Deneen or others, they broadly agree on these questions. The substantive moral content of liberalism is, and I quote Deneen again, that it teaches a people to hedge commitments and adopt flexible relationships and bonds. Not only are all political and economic relationships seen as fungible and subject to constant redefinition, so are all relationships, to place, to neighborhood, to nation, to family, and to religion. Liberalism encourages loose connections. Again, in the piece that I'm writing at the moment, there's like lots of other quotes, but essentially that really captures the general sentiment that you find in contemporary conservative anti-liberalism. And now some of you who have been around longer and have a good sense of history will say, look, this has been this sort of point, we've heard it about, I don't know, thousands of times, I guess. It's the most sort of banal, classic critique of liberalism that we've heard. And I think, that's a way to end the debate. But I think there's probably more to be said about this, and in a way we can take it seriously in ways that might productively also shed lights on some of the blind spots of contemporary liberal thinking and democratic thinking. Now, let me continue a little bit, because I think there are some more interesting and more detailed accounts of how, especially these American anti-liberal conservatives, construe a story of how liberalism became hegemonic. And one thing that's really interesting is that many of them seem to agree that liberalism's sort of all-encompassing, all sort of community-destroying effect really only became visible and palpable after the Second World War. Even those we considered liberals before the Second World War, I mean, I don't know, this is a debate we can have. I'm not convinced that FDR was liberal, but they would say like he's maybe on the liberal side. But look, even under FDR, says one of these figures in, I think, a language that captures it well, Yoram Hazony, he says, even FDR, he was a proponent not of liberal democracy, but of God-fearing democracy. He affirmed that there is no cultural pluralism, that we don't aim for a moral universalist justification of the social bonds in our society, but we have something that is much more firmly rooted in Christianity. And for Hazony, who wrote this big book, Conservatism, A Rediscovery, which I think is actually worth reading if you're willing, he really tries to make the case that with a couple of important courts decisions that ruled that state governments could no longer support or encourage religion, he blames the Supreme Court for a lot of this activism. And ultimately also with the fact that Congress, the US Congress in 1965 passed the Immigration and Naturalization Act, which limited, as he puts it, the preferences for immigrants, belonging to Western and Northern European nationalities. All of this completed, here again I quote Hazony, the bloodless revolution in which the old assumption of a Christian nation rooted in the English legal tradition was replaced by a liberal state modeled on the social contract theories of Enlightenment rationalist philosophers. And this altogether is, as they put it, just not sustainable, because it erodes whatever moral basis our communities have. Now, I'm happy to discuss this. I don't want to take a position on whether I find this plausible. I mostly find it just like a common conservative trope. And I think there are some important observations in there that we can agree on, and maybe some observations that seem completely hyperbolic. So that's something we can maybe spare now and pick up again in the Q&A. I think what's more interesting, and this is also where I think lies a challenge for liberal philosophy, is that there is a way forward that is presented in most of these writings. Whether you look at Hazony, Denin, whether you look at even more radical figures like Adrian Vermeule and fellow integralists, it usually is centered on building a conservative anti-liberal counter movement from below. There is a sense in which one might say an idea that we know more commonly from the 1960s left counterculture from below is now here appropriated and presented as the way forward for conservative renewal. Patrick Deneen, in Why Liberalism Failed, again, kind of maybe the most impactful of these books, begins in the preface with a quote by the Czech dissident Václav Havel. And that quote is, "A better system will not automatically ensure a better life. In fact, the opposite is true. Only by creating a better life can a better system be developed." So a lot of people sort of on the liberal left tend to accuse, 5 minutes, perfect, tend to accuse these conservative anti-liberals for being very vague about their institutional commitments. Maybe that's not true with Agenda 2025. Maybe that's not true with people who defend the unitary executive theory, and Hazony has that sort of implicit in his text, but I'm not going to go into that. But I think one of the reasons why we don't find institutional blueprints is because a lot of their thinking is geared not so much towards the question of institutional change and transformation, but about changing people's hearts and minds. And, now using a sort of giving it a Platonic twist, we can call it a form of anti-liberal soulcraft. And I think that's really interesting because we don't find liberal soulcraft in many of the liberal texts we read these days. But conversely, the anti-liberal conservatives that I'm particularly interested in usually offer us more or less clear guidelines of how to be a good conservative. And I find that exceedingly interesting, not least because it seems to me to speak to, it seems to me to be consistent with the idea, which is the idea that all of them hold, that liberal society creates something like a rootless individual without orientation, and then we need sort of at the end of particularly brainless bestsellers, sorry for being normative, we find Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, and then sort of more intellectual versions further down in the work of Denin or Hazony. Now, Denin is always a bit coy about what he actually wants, at least in his writings. And I find that interesting, but he does give a bit away. He talks very flatteringly about the old customs held in the US. And here's a quote that nicely summarizes this. "You should respect authority beginning with your parents. You should display modest and courteous comportment. You should avoid displays of lewdness and titillation. You should engage in sexual activity only when married. Once married, you should stay married. You should have children, generally lots of them. You should live within your means. You should thank and worship the Lord. You should pay respect to the elderly and remember and acknowledge your debts to the dead." Now, that might seem, like a program. And the question is, of course, is this something we want to implement directly? Should we just follow this? I think Denin doesn't offer much of a guide. He says we need to start with these local communities and local ways of life, and these need to be transformed in this way, because that's what served us for a long time. Again, not a particularly new or original argument. Perhaps more interestingly, I think is Hazony's take on it, who clearly says, look, political conservatism, I'm quoting here, cannot be separated from personal conservatism. And then he goes on about, how you should read the Bible, how you should, have also a family, lots of children, and so on. And of course, that's all fine. I think the interesting point is perhaps, how much time do I have left? 2 minutes, wonderful. The interesting question that all of these sort of guidelines for a good conservative life, and I'm happy to expand on this in the Q&A, but I gave you already a first glimpse by reflecting on it. One thing that's obviously interesting in this is it does indeed offer real guidance, right? Hazony writes, in a liberal society, the individual is plagued by an inability to distinguish what is honorable and what is dishonorable, and what is worthy from what is unworthy. And so society comes to be characterized by the decadence of the individual, who is drowning in a sea of alternatives, none of which matter anymore. And if this is actually what you believe about the societies we live in, I'm the first, I would say, others for us to judge really, but I think I really am an empathetic reader. And I can really see how, if that's how you feel where we're going, the alternatives proposed are indeed very, very attractive. Now, I want to end with two big questions for liberals. The first question is, of course, if the core of a conservative anti-liberal project today is quite contrary to what a lot of political scientists think, although I don't think they're wrong on that, is not about, it's not institutional transformation. The core of it is the transformation of the self, right? Soulcraft. If that is at the core of it, what does a liberal way of life as a sort of counter image to it look like? What sort of practices do we need to think about that in a way that it doesn't become, just a sort of arbitrary, choose whatever you want and we'll find and we'll tolerate you? I don't have a good answer, but I think it's an interesting question. And one political theorist who I admire very much, Alexandre Lefebvre, has recently written a book, Liberalism as a Way of Life. I think that is part of the answer. The problem is, if you excuse my religious wording, that book amounts to preaching to the converted. This is a book that is made for liberals, because ultimately what Lefebvre suggests is, look, it's true, we're liberal in a way, we kind of accepted it, but we need to cultivate it by, reading Rawls, going back to the original position and do this as a spiritual exercise every now and then. I think that's maybe not sufficient as an answer, but I think it's a challenge. And I do personally think, and I'm happy to discuss that as well, that a lot of older texts, pragmatist philosophers, Dewey, people who self-confidently in the first half of the 20th century talked about democracy as a way of life, the question of what a democratic education is, they might have better answers than necessarily Rawls. There's a second point, and I think that's really just a final observation. I think what's interesting is when we now go back to Rawls as sort of the Bible of 20th century, second half 20th century liberalism, what's very interesting in Rawls is Rawls does something very analogous to Habermas and a lot of critical theorists. He connects the evolution of liberal societies to the moral psychology of humans and the psychological development of the individual. And for Rawls, I don't know whether whether you're good Rawlsians, but in the theory of justice, in the third part, there's this description of the evolution of the individual, starting with sort of different stages, going through different stages of moral development, starting with the morality of authority. So as a child, you accept the authority of your parent. And in the next stage, as you realize there's other people than your parents and that you're kind of embedded in a community, you get to something like a morality of association. And finally, you realize you're in a society of lots of different communities, so the Rawlsian story goes, and you end up with a morality of principles, which is kind of a universalist understanding of which principles order society. Now, what's interesting is, and this is what I want to end on, anti-liberal conservatives, if we take this scheme seriously as a developmental story, anti-liberal conservatives basically suggest that the stage of morality of principles is too demanding for any individual. We cannot go beyond the morality of association, and that association is a Christian nation. To me, this is a different story, an affirmative story of, I would call, democratic backsliding. You move from a universalist perspective to a decidedly non-universalist one. And I think, we might have something to learn from the psychological underpinnings of that story, because ultimately soulcraft is a deeply psychological endeavor. Thank you.